Welcome to the 82nd reading of my memoir, The Innocence of Guilt. I'm learning, but the guilt still lingers. Early in spring, I started jogging around the neighborhood to lose a few pounds from binge eating due to stress. I now ate sensibly and could jog for half an hour without stopping. I looked forward to my 37th birthday with more hope than ever before. The timing of my new state of wellness coincided with Brian's interest in fostering children, as our associate pastor and his wife did. However, we attended one information meeting and came home disillusioned, told to expect the worst. Our house smashed up by out-of-control, emotionally damaged children. Not a welcome thought. Putting the idea aside, we decided to move into a smaller house in a different neighborhood. We simply didn't want to invest all our money into furnishing and decorating our large 1,500 square foot house with a basement, the same size, largely unused, a never-ending project. I became ashamed of how when we first moved in, I'd proudly written a letter home to Mum about the house. I wrote that when I closed the solid front door, I knew we'd reached a higher status in society by owning a house in such a prestigious neighborhood. Whatever must she have thought of such an arrogant statement? I soon discovered that material wealth had nothing to do with your worth as a human being, or with your happiness and peace of mind, for that matter. 7723 84th Avenue was a small, neat bungalow with white siding overlooking a beautiful green crescent in an area of southeast Edmonton called Idlewild. In the front garden stood a large climbable tree. From Karen's point of view, the tree made the house perfect. We need look no further. Once we'd been inside, we agreed and bought it. We moved in at the beginning of August. We liked the area. Within walking distance of the Bonnie Doon shopping centre, schools and public transport. Not long after moving in, having given up the idea of fostering, we sat down and discussed adoption. Karen and Gary both stated their wishes. Karen still wanted the sister I hadn't been able to give her, and Gary wanted a brother, so one of them would be disappointed. In the end, we decided to take whatever gender we were offered, but we'd wait 1 year for a newborn, and then settle for no older than 18 months. At one of the meetings with Doug, our easygoing social worker, Karen said, "Do you think we might get twins?" "I don't think so. They don't come along very often," Doug answered with a chuckle. The only certainty he could offer us was that we would have to accept a mixed-race child, as we already had 2 biological children. No problem. Alone in the house one afternoon, I went over to the sofa, knelt down beside it, and began to pray. I found myself in a place not of this world. The strong, loving arms of somebody I perceived to be my Heavenly Father wrapped around me, saturated with love and acceptance. A different experience from the Jesus light shown to me in St. Albright's back in England in 1960. It gave me the calm assurance of a father's love. Accepting the idea of a Heavenly Father had long been a problem for me, because I hadn't been raised with the earthly version of one. The encounter convinced me beyond any doubt that he wasn't the vengeful God so often portrayed in the writings of the Old Testament. As I learnt more and more to trust God with my life, I grew painfully aware of how far I still had to go. The Valium pills were still part of my daily regimen, but they didn't seem to be helping me much, if indeed they ever had. I spoke to one of the women I met at a Bible study about my seeming addiction to them, how I'd watch the clock until the time arrived to take the next pill. She said they were definitely addictive and perhaps I ought to throw them away in the garbage, but she added, only if I felt ready for such a huge step. One day, Brian came home from work to find me cutting up pages and pages of paper into tiny scraps and stuffing them all into a large plastic garbage bag. "What are you doing?" he asked, a look of puzzlement on his face. "I'm getting rid of my diaries," I told him. "Why?" He knew how much my diaries meant to me. I explained to him how every time I read them, they plunged me into depression. Full of such negative writings, I feared the children would one day read them and feel as sad as I did when I wrote them. "Well, I guess you know what you're doing," he said with a shrug, but I could tell he had some doubt. I didn't tell him that I had thrown out the Valium pills too, that very day. The pills he didn't even know existed. In July of 1980, we planned another trip to England, but I had doubts about going. Brian knew this time it wasn't one of my panic attacks causing me concern. Earlier in the year, patches of snow still on the ground, I'd gone out jogging. 2 days later, I came down with pneumonia. Every breath brought excruciating pain. Brian took charge of the house for 4 or 5 days while I lay in bed, positive I must be dying. I couldn't even keep down water, and imagined that my poor mum must have gone through a similar trial at Park Farm. Although I recovered from the worst of it, it took me weeks to get back my energy, and I suffered from bouts of exhaustive coughing for months afterwards. I managed to get to England, however, although I couldn't keep up the hectic day-to-day pace of sightseeing and sometimes stayed at home while Brian and the children went to the beach with his parents. At least I didn't have the burden of OCD to hold me back from enjoying the holiday. While in Colchester, we were able to stay at Mum's house. David provided us with an inflatable bed, which he set up in her bedroom. She had taken to sleeping downstairs in the front room in a single bed. And Karen and Gary slept in twin beds in what used to be my old bedroom at the front of the house. The added convenience of a bathroom and lavatory upstairs helped enormously with our comfort. It had been installed shortly before our arrival. A few disputes over the hot water and towels ensued. Towels we'd in fact bought her. We offered to put money in the gas meter to pay for the hot water, but she refused, preferring to argue with me over the need to pop the children in the tub at the end of a hot and dusty day. I thought it the quickest way to get them clean, but David said she didn't use the bathroom herself. She'd never wanted it. The town council insisted that the houses be upgraded and gave each homeowner a grant. Mum still did her nightly wash with a bowl on the living room table. Old habits die hard. It probably overwhelmed her to have the 4 of us living there. She wasn't used to cooking meals for such a number of people, although the first day she surpassed herself by serving up an Irish casserole full of flavorful root vegetables. As we tucked into it after the long journey, I said to her, "Mum, this is amazing. It tastes wonderful." I thought we would be given more of the same throughout the visit. It turned out to be the only hot meal she served the 2 weeks we stayed with her. We offered to buy food and help her cook it, but she insisted on the mostly cold, uninteresting fare that she no doubt daily served up for herself. I must admit it frustrated me, as my children were used to better. Afterwards I suffered terrible guilt over my attitude towards her. My memory constantly served up the vision of her serving up the precious casserole in her small, unpretentious room on the first day of our visit. For months afterwards I could smell it in my nose and taste it in my mouth. Mum's loving offering, made with her careworn, loving hands. The memory ate at my soul, and I feared the guilt would eat me into oblivion. David's little daughter, Charlotte, was 8 years old at the time of our visit. Mum doted on her as well she might, but I sensed that my children took second place in her affections when Charlotte came. Mum made a point of telling us that she always put a chocolate bar in the cupboard for Charlotte to find. Sure enough, Charlotte made her way like a well-trained circus animal to the cupboard to get her treat, but in full view of Karen and Gary, for whom no chocolate bar was forthcoming. I do believe they noticed the favoritism, although to give them credit, neither of them said anything at the time. Much later on, I understood more clearly the reasons behind Mum's attitude and seeming lack of connectedness towards her Canadian grandchildren. She didn't love them less than her one English grandchild. Photographs were her primary knowledge of them for the most part, a poor substitute for the flesh and blood reality of them. She didn't know all their peculiarities, their little whims and fancies. My children were mostly strangers to her, separated by such a vast distance. We asked her if she'd like to visit over Christmas and experience a Canadian winter for the first time. I recall us standing by the travel agents on the corner of Head Street and Crouch Street in Colchester the day before taking off to Shropshire by train to visit Barry and Jill and their 18-month-old son, Timothy. We said we could buy her the ticket there and then. She wouldn't commit to coming, so our parting words as we waved goodbye were, "Don't forget to think about coming for Christmas." But she looked as if the very thought was too much. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to subscribe, like, or comment on this reading, and hopefully you will tune in to the next one. Bye for now.